All right. Sorry about the technical difficulties, guys. We're trying to get our second panelist in here, but I'm just going to kick things off and then I will work on that. So without further ado, thank you all for joining the MindShift webinar series hosted by O3 World. O3 World is a digital product agency that helps businesses accelerate and innovate. We work with brands like Vertex and La Colombe and Children's Hospital to create digital products that people around the world love using every day. Today, we'll be exploring what it means to maximize the power of AI across your organization. O3 World's co-founder and Chief Innovation Officer, Mike Gadsby, will be kicking us off here in a minute. But before I hand things over to Mike, I wanted to introduce our panel today. So first, we have Dave Lauer. He's the CEO of Urvin AI, an agency focused on transforming data into opportunity. Thanks, Dave, for being here. And we also have Olivia Gambelin, all the way from Brussels. She's the founder and CEO of Ethical Intelligence Associates, here with us today. Olivia works to bring ethical analysis into tech development to create human-centric innovation for a better tomorrow. Thanks for joining us, Olivia. I will work to get you up on screen here momentarily. But mostly we're just really excited to have some great conversations today. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Mike to get us started.
Great. Well, thank you, Carol. So let's just start with what we're talking about today, which is fundamentally AI, right? And I think what's interesting is that now, like more than ever, AI is sort of taking the center stage as it becomes a core feature to future business strategies. But what is interesting about it is there is a gap between sort of ambition, this idea of how do we get AI strategy in place and what do we need to sort of make that a reality, and then the reality of execution. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about demystifying AI, talk a little bit about the relationship between AI and data, and talk about the experiences that AI is allowing us to really implement across at least our clients and certainly the wider industry in general. So let's just start with a quick overview. Let's make a definition here, right? When we talk about AI, a lot of times AI gets confused and sort of grouped up and mashed up with terms like machine learning and deep learning. And while we don't need to get into the details of how all these things work, the reality is, you know, machine learning is sort of a subset of AI and deep learning is sort of a subset of that. But overall, what we're talking about is this idea of building intelligent systems that solve complex problems, where, you know, we have the influence of data and then the sort of collection of data to really help to educate and train systems. But let's start with that and this relationship between data and AI in general. You know, when we think about any AI conversation that we typically have, this is where it starts. And it's usually, you know, you have some executive who has some big ideas about what AI is going to do for their business. And the first questions we ask is really, okay, well, what kind of data do you have? What data do we have available? And then ultimately, what can we do with that data? The reality is it's not a single data source that trains these algorithms and ultimately what builds these AI models. It's a lot of different data sources that really makes this happen. And it's the sort of understanding, wrangling of data, as I know Dave puts it over there at Urvin, and this sort of need to really understand it, clean it up, and leverage it, that really becomes core to how we implement these AI systems. Just like kids, you know, AI is no different, right? So kids have context to certain things, say like a hot stove and what that means. You know, as we grow up and we have more data that gets sort of, you know, put into our minds, we have a better understanding about, you know, the whole reality of a kitchen and what not to touch and how not to touch it, right? Well, AI models work very similarly. When we think about AI, though, we don't really think about AI as a just this a technology. We think about it as a tool, and a tool that's going to allow us to expand what we look at our agency as experiences, right? And we look at some key experiences these days that we're pretty excited about. You know, the first is really an automation. You can certainly think about this in areas like manufacturing and the like, where we're trying to, remove dangerous or potentially really tedious tasks and replace them with, smart systems. We've used it recently on some internal projects that help us sort of automate a lot of our workflows. But these are just the same systems that do very similar things. Secondarily for us is the concept of personalization, particularly in marketing, particularly in application development. You're looking at a Nike running app I use, but that running app's pretty great. All the runs I do, where I run in the city, et cetera, they offer me then products based on that data. That's a pretty good use of AI to help sort of push retail and push those experiences. And it's an exciting area that we're getting really involved with as well. Third is really in conversation. When we think about computer systems and we think about interfaces, a lot of these sort of UI we've become comfortable with over the years, quite frankly, we had to learn and we had to get used to over time. A much more comfortable way of interfacing with technology is in conversation. It's something that we've learned over our lives to make that much easier. A really good example, and what I think is right in our backyard here in Philadelphia, is the work Comcast has done with their voice remote. I think is remarkable. I mean, quite frankly, I've enjoyed my television experience so much more through that. But we do a lot of work in chatbots and that sort of thing as well, where or even just texting and SMS, where this has become very prevalent as well. And then finally, in prediction, we think about prediction, I think sometimes in like, how are we going to win the stock market or something along those lines. I actually think about prediction more in robotic systems that can start to think about the next stage of an experience. And I think things like the self-driving car that, Google's putting together really good examples of that. It would not be able to know to make a left or right turn or stop at a stop sign if it didn't have that influx of data and predict the next step or move of the things around it, which is a pretty remarkable technology. So I'm gonna just get going here. We're gonna get into our panelist discussion. I'm gonna stop sharing here and just hop right in. Olivia, Dave, thank you very much for joining us. I'm gonna just hop into this first question here. Let's just sort of get this discussion going. So, in each of your experiences, how do you think organizations are best using AI, and what are the attributes you see as sort of critical for getting there? So why don't we start with Olivia to sort of hop right into that? First of all, welcome. I'm glad you were able to get into the panel here.
Oh, thank you, Mike. There you go. I am glad as well. It seems like I got myself lost in the multitude of webinars and links to everything I've been trying to sort through today. So apologies for that. Got it figured out though, thankfully. Yes, so to hop right into your question though about how, in my experience, organizations are using AI. So as I think Carol mentioned before, my background is in AI ethics. So specifically, I focus on the ethics, the values, the human-based values when it comes to using technology. So I'll speak from a bit of a different angle here. But the organizations that I see using AI as a tool and an experience to the fullest possible extent are the ones that consider their ethical implications and consequences from the onset. And they look to actually embed these ethical values into their systems, into their processes. They work from the ground up instead of building the system and then looking back and trying to fix it. It's something that's at the forefront of their mind as they start to embrace AI into their companies. So those are probably the best examples I can think of when I see a company really using AI to its fullest. It's when they do so with ethics at the forefront of the mind. So maybe a little bit of a different angle there, but.
Yeah, but important attributes, right? I mean, I think one of the interesting parts about AI overall is, what we're trying to do is basically simulate or leverage sort of human intelligence in all this. And I think one of those core factors certainly is ethics and how we sort of think about how we're leveraging that technology, in a positive and productive way. Dave, you want to hop into this and take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think, from what I've seen, and I come at this from a different perspective, one of sort of, an applied sense. We work closely with businesses to help them deliver AI projects into production at scale. And but I see exactly what Olivia sees, that when you see a project that is driven and understands the ethics of what they're doing, they're generally being driven by the business, not by necessarily by technologists. And when you see an organization trying to accomplish a business objective or trying to address a challenge that they or their clients face, and to do it in a responsible way with that sort of long-term understanding and vision, that means that they're coming at it from a fundamentally different perspective than, let's say, a technology group who has a nice shiny piece of technology that they want to use. And so, I think one of the biggest determinants of success that we see is this sort of starting from that challenge, starting from trying to address a real world issue or a real world inefficiency, or to build a new offering, and to do so in a way in which they are bridging that gap between the people that don't understand the technology, but do understand the business and do understand the legal and regulatory environments that they exist in, and what their customers want, and perhaps some of the pitfalls that they might face when they're adopting a kind of technology that can get deep into somebody's data, as well as the technology side of things, and understanding technology and how it can enable or solve some of those challenges.
Yeah, I think, hopping into the challenges, I think, is a really good way of looking at this. I mean, I know we've discussed in past sort of client engagements and whatnot, being very focused on use cases and making sure that we're still very problem centric when leveraging AI or thinking about it from that perspective. But I think it's a good segue in talking about, a couple topics. And I know Olivia will have quite a few thoughts on this. When we think about, though, the experiences we're trying to deliver, let's think about those AI models and why might they be flawed, either in their bias or overall accuracy, and how can organizations chart a better path forward there? Olivia, you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the most common misconceptions is, oh, well, our system, our model isn't working because it's not accurate. It's not giving us the answers that we want, because it's giving us answers that are clearly racially biased. In that case, it's not actually, 9 times out of 10, it's actually not the model. It's the data set, or how the model was constructed, or how the data was labeled in the first place. What people tend to forget is the systems are designed to spot these patterns and turn out these answers. And so a system is going to be very, very good at picking up a data set that has inherent racial bias in it, either through its labeling or either because it was picking up from societal patterns. So if it starts to amplify that racial bias, and I'm just using racial bias since it's very topical in the news recently, but this works with all types of biases, all types of unwanted biases. If the data set, or if the previous information or the information it's pulling out of societal patterns is there and inherently biased on a certain level, then the model is going to amplify that. So it actually is very accurate. So one of those problems is asking yourself, okay, is this accurate towards something that I'm actually not necessarily knowing that was there, or wanting to amplify, but now is being amplified through this technology. And then if you go back to the roots and see, okay, well, according to our data set, with the way we've labeled it, it's coming out with this is why we're seeing this answer coming out on the other end. Then of course, you've solved a bit of a question there, but if that doesn't solve it, then start to look at the model. So with that, I would say, especially with unwanted biases, is take a look back at the people that built it first. Take a look at how they've really psychologically approached the problem that they're looking to solve, and look at the data. Now, this doesn't mean throw more data at a model and it'll fix it. It means looking at the data that you have already used, and actually unpacking what the implications that are within that data set already there.
Yeah, for sure. And we talk a lot, and Dave, I know you and I talked a ton about just data accuracy and thinking about, flawed approaches. Olivia, what you're bringing up, I think is a really interesting point where it's, the data doesn't in fact lie, right? It is what it is. And what we leverage there and what we use from it is really important. When we think about personalization and some of the tactics that we have in place, that we have to be really cognizant of that around really what we're delivering. Dave, I'm sure you have a slightly different spin on this. Be interested to get your 2 cents.
Yeah, it's funny because we talk and hear so much these days, especially about diversity and inclusivity. And this is just the perfect illustration of a real world example of why you need that kind of thing, right? If you don't have a properly diverse team, both defining the application, as Olivia is talking about, and building the technology, you're going to have blind spots. You're going to miss things. There's just no way around that. The only way around that is having a really strong, diverse team from different backgrounds who are looking at the problem in different ways. I don't see a way around that. I've seen it, and I think in the news, especially, we have seen this happen too many times, and it isn't necessarily an issue with bad intentions or unethical people, though that can happen with Facebook. But you could see things like, for example, if anyone's familiar with this Harrisburg University study that was done, where they went out and an academic group said, we're going to look at pictures of people's faces to see if we can determine whether they're more likely to commit a crime. I mean, that should be on its surface quite clearly problematic. And from hindsight, it's easy to understand that it was going to become a racially biased system, and simply, as Olivia is saying, demonstrate the racial inequities of our criminal justice system, let's say. But these very well-meaning academics didn't see that going into it, and I think it's a good example of something where perhaps a more diverse team would have spotted something like that.
Yeah, and this isn't even, listen, I think you guys are definitely pointing out, certainly with racial bias, but this definitely speaks back to, I think, just bias overall. The reality is, if you're trying to mimic, human intelligence, the more diverse in that thinking and the approach overall for any solution you're trying to encounter or embrace is going to have just better outcomes in general. Otherwise, you're going to have a very myopic view and a very myopic solution to what you're trying to solve for. Well, let's take this one step further. Let's start talking about AI solutions. We're talking a little bit about sort of the flawed dynamics of data, but let's start talking about actually getting some solutions into the market. So let's talk about precisely how organizations, as I know Urvin puts it, can get AI sort of out of the lab and into production. What are some of the things that orgs can do to move beyond sort of pilots, proofs of concepts into like actual scalable AI solutions?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. This is a really critical question, and what we see and what the study shows that only 10% of AI projects end up successfully deployed into production. And from our perspective, we just seen time and again when we come into a new client and they're just pulling their hair out because they have a proof of concept in the lab and it works great, and it just doesn't scale, it doesn't generalize, it doesn't provide the features and flexibility that the business needs to either internally to solve a problem or externally to offer a new service or product to their clients or a new capability. And I think what people often fail to understand is that a lab demonstration of AI is just a completely different exercise than designing a scalable, generalizable system that can create value. So, I put together a couple of red flags that we've seen that, everyone should maybe be attuned to. The biggest one is our data scientists tried a bunch of different models. They found one that fits the data the best, and so they went with that. That is the wrong approach. That's a backwards approach to solving AI challenges. Another major red flag is when you're working with a group that specializes in one kind of approach. Deep learning is probably the best example of that. It's the most popular right now. And the danger there is that to groups like that, they've got a hammer, and so every problem is a nail. And finally, Another big concern we've seen is when a data science team is just completely dependent on open source libraries or cloud-based tools. And it's not to say that such tools don't have value at times and are often part of nearly every solution. But it's often an indicator that this group has a more superficial understanding of what they're doing, and that in terms of tool capabilities and shortcomings. And it's also important to know that the cloud providers who are pushing deep learning as an approach because it's more computationally intensive are doing so because their business model is to sell cloud resources, not deliver the most valuable insights for your business. And so, any of these things are things that will lead to potentially solutions that look good in a limited way, but they just don't scale into production, or they end up with biases or ethical problems because of such a narrow view. So, to be constructive and to take another minute here, like we said before, you start with the business challenge, you understand business level requirements, and then you decide what features are needed. And that's how having a very deep understanding of different AI approaches and experience putting those into production, you can decide as a team together, the business and the technology team, what's the right approach. Then the second part is, of course, the data, as we briefly talked about. What's available, what form is it in, how dirty is it, what potential data might also be available. And when you take those two things and you put them together with an experienced team of AI scientists and software developers, that's when you can get something that is generalizable and can be pushed into production at scale.
Olivia, I'd love to hear your 2 cents on that as well. Before I do that, though, just for everybody who's attending, if you do have a question, we'd like to open after this. We'd like to open it up to audience questions. Please pop them in the chat. We'll take them and sort of get them back to Olivia and Dave here. Olivia, I didn't know if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, just a quick little point. Dave, you had amazing examples there, so I'm not going to talk too long here. But I just wanted to make a comment that innovation for innovation's sake is not good in and of itself.
Yes.
Just because it looks fancy doesn't mean it's going to work well. And with that, when you are looking to start deploying these systems, start to developing them and designing them, ask yourself, what bottom line are you using? Are you just using profit as your bottom line, or are you incorporating people and planet into that as well, into this kind of triple bottom line thought process, where you're not just considering using technology to turn a profit and grow for innovation's sake, but instead looking at the effects it's having on the people and planet around you as well.
Yeah, I can't agree with that more. And I think, if we're talking about AI that gets into production, we're talking about sustainable approaches. We're talking about approaches that are helpful and adding value. And, if you don't have a firm ethical foundation, both as a company, but also within this specialization of AI, even the best designed AI systems can have disastrous consequences, as we've seen, and lead to big, at best, PR problems, at worst, starting to change people's incentives and how they interact with each other and how we consume information in potentially bad ways.
It's great. So this is actually a pretty good segue into sort of getting back into the reality of AI. But we got our first question here. So could you share a specific example of a problem where AI can actually produce results? And what should I expect in terms of time to market, or what my team needs to look like to work with an AI expert?
So, a lot of what every company has different experiences with it, and they've got different goals and different data that they're trying to leverage. So, I would say what we tend to specialize in is unstructured data and finding meaning within unstructured data. And so, again, that's a really good example of something where you can leverage our technical expertise, but we're also very dependent on the domain expertise of the companies that we're working with. And so I think when those two things come together, that's when you have some of the most powerful solutions. And in terms of what the teams look like, we've seen very different teams. We're often working with technical teams, but the more we involve the business and the more we involve the non-technical people, I think the more success we've seen. And so, it depends. It is the best answer I can give in terms of like what your team should look like. But having a technical person who understands the business and technology is best case. But having, a business person who can be, that bridge to technology, we can also make that work.
Yeah, just to add to that too, I know in our experience, certainly from a business objective perspective, I mean, it's good to have at least some people who are somewhat fluent in the data on their end to make this work. Oftentimes, we get handed we want to, leverage AI for some specific use case. And then once we get into the data questions, just even trying to get to the data can be a challenge. So really having somebody who's somewhat familiar, not a data scientist, but definitely knows where to get it, how to get it, and what's being collected is really helpful. Olivia, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. We do have a second question, which I think is probably right up your alley. So yeah, okay, great. So the question here is, I worry that bias being a symptom of larger systemic issues of finding the right data is hard to find since injustice is baked in. Can you share an example of types of data sets that helped unbias the algorithm?
Well, there are such things as fairness metrics that you can use to essentially look at how you can balance out your data sets or test how fair they are. That's where a lot of that bias seeps in. The irony of that, though, is in choosing your fairness metric, you are then adding bias back in. One of the great examples of this was, I believe it was actually with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where according to the fairness metric that the company used, their data set was fair and their algorithm was unbiased. But as soon as an outside auditor came in and ran with a different fairness metric, they came across, no, there's actually a bias in here. So that's all to say, it's not really a shortcut you can take. Dave, I'd love for you to jump in here with a bit more of the technical side. But that is, again, as soon as you start introducing more layers and more layers, there's more and more possibilities to have bias come back into the system, even though you're trying to remove it.
Yeah, it's there's no easy answer to this question, and so many people are struggling with this exact issue. The best I can say is, having a diverse group of people involved is a big step. It really is, and I don't just say that for diversity's sake. It's just that it's just so easy to have blind spots, and it's not just diversity, gender or racial diversity, but it's also experiential diversity and skill set diversity, right? It doesn't just have to be AI scientists involved. Again, you can have the most racially and gender diverse group of AI scientists in the world, and they have had a very narrow path to becoming that, to finding themselves in that position. As you broaden out and you involve psychologists and sociologists and anthropologists and physicists and different people in different roles for different kinds of projects, you can often find that at least you can identify the bias, or at least be made aware of your blind spots. And that's kind of the sorry, unfortunately, the best I can offer, because it's just each situation is pretty unique.
Yeah, I think you know what you're getting at, though, and I think this is really the reality. I think that it's a concern, that it's a priority, and that you are, as an organization, taking the steps necessary to continually assess your data, assess the outcomes, and ultimately create measurable results that sort of align with not just the business results you were looking for, but the values that you're trying to adhere to. I think that's critical. We see the same, within like user testing, right? Like, it's not just a matter of getting the answer you're looking for. It's a matter of painfully seeking the truth.
Yeah, and let me just add a point to that, Mike, which is exactly important, or exactly aligned with what you're just saying, is that AI projects are really a process, right? They're not a point in time delivery. And yes, software development, you're always adding versions and features, but I find that AI is actually very different than software development from that perspective, because you're always changing and honing the system, hopefully learning more over time. The system is getting better at what it does over time. And so getting the right kind of processes and controls in place so that you can make that process more robust, and hopefully that process can expose shortcomings over time, is another really important step.
Yeah, absolutely. Real quick follow up to that, and then this will probably be the last question. But same sort of context. But I imagine including data sets from unlikely sources might help, even unconventional data sets. Do businesses ever let you include unconventional data sets?
Unconventional. I'm trying to think. I mean, from in finance, you see a lot of what are called alternative data sets. But I don't know that I would call them necessarily unconventional. Sometimes you can integrate sort of social media information or satellite information or foot traffic and that kind of thing. But I don't know that I would call those unconventional. Yeah, I mean, I know that generally the clients that we've worked with are always open to creative approaches and creative solutions. Again, it's very much sort of project dependent, but I haven't found resistance provided that data is, that there aren't licensing or copyright issues, for example.
Olivia, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think Dave got most of that from. Yeah, I'll leave it with Dave. Dave.
All right. Well, thank you both. And I didn't know if either of you had a final thought on any of this. I mean, what we're talking about is sort of the new world, right? I don't know. I mean, we had 3 calls over the last 2 days just on these exact conversations. It's like, well, what can we do to build predictive systems? How can we build better customer experiences leveraging AI? And it really all starts with this part, which is, all right, let's start assessing data sets. Let's start seeing what you have available to you. If you don't have the data available to you, let's start building upon it. And then let's build sort of proofs of concepts to sort of help speed the plow a bit to get to where we're going. So I think this is definitely a really interesting topic to be hitting on. But do either you just have like a final point? Anything else you want to sort of get out there?
Olivia, anything?
I'll jump in from the ethicist point of view. Remember, at the end of the day, AI is a tool. It's a very powerful tool, but it is a tool. It's a tool made by humans, and we humans are beautifully messy. And I think that's actually a benefit for us. But to remember that we are the ones creating these systems for other humans. There are other people on the other side of it. So to keep in mind that you're not just creating this to create it, you're creating it for someone that it's going to have an impact on someone on the other side. But that being said, it's a fantastic opportunity and a fantastic tool at the end of the day.
Yeah, I can't agree with that more. I mean, it's such an exciting time to be in this space. There's just incredible opportunity and possibility. And I think it's really exciting how people are more aware of all of these issues, the ethical considerations of it. Olivia and I sit on an editorial board of a new academic journal, the Journal of AI and Ethics. And that's, there's huge demand for that kind of information. So that's really heartening to see. And then the other side of it is that you finally have a lot of people out there with the experience of putting these systems into production at scale and really affecting change in some very impressive ways. And so, we're really at the cusp of all of this, and it's just great to see.
That's great. Listen, I appreciate both of your time. We're certainly, I think hit on some interesting things. I mean, this is sort of one of those discussions that I feel like could go on forever if we really wanted to get into it, because it is so fascinating. When you get into a lot of the background around the data, et cetera, I think what we're talking about here is something that everybody can sort of benefit from, or should be thinking about anyways, as they sort of develop their business strategies moving forward. So thank you both. Really appreciate your time. It was definitely great insight. And then just in general, I just want to say thanks for everyone for, joining the webinar. We will share sort of a recording of the presentation via email later this week. If you do have any more questions, anything we can do to sort of answer these questions about data or business value around AI, et cetera, please contact us at info@o3world.com. And then, if you're interested in taking a deeper dive into your data strategy, we will be, this is the first of many episodes of MindShift. So please do sign up for our next MindShift webinar. Episode 2 is transforming CX with data insights, and what we're going to be talking about there is sort of overcoming the challenges related to data collection and data insights. So really just a spin-off of a lot of what we just discussed. But we're going to be hopping into a little more around customer experiences and the impact of data and creating these sort of personalized and hopefully profitable customer experiences based on that. So thank you everyone for joining in, and yeah, we look forward to seeing you again next time.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks.